Welcome to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we are talking about grit and why you need it in law school. Your Law School Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan and Lee Burgess. That's me. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the Catapult Conference. Alison also runs the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review on iTunes. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started.
Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we're talking about something we think every law student needs, and it's not a laptop, it's grit. So let's get started. First off, Lee, what do we even mean by grit? I mean, people kind of throw this term around, but I mean, we're not talking about dirt here, right?
No. When someone has grit, they have courage and resolve. They are able to conquer the challenges placed in their way and overcome failure. They work towards their goals for weeks, months, or even years. Someone who has grit can persevere even when things aren't going their way. And as you mentioned, grit has become a really popular buzzword and was brought to the forefront by a woman named Angela Duckworth, who was catapulted to the forefront of the field after delivering a TED Talk that we're going to link to in the show notes. So
nice.
In your free time, you can check out a TED Talk on grit, not in the library time, in your free time. There's a lot of talk about the importance of grit, especially in the academic setting, even starting with young children. But it is a very important thing you have to have in law school. So, Alison, some people might be saying, okay, well, why is grit so important in the law school space?
Well, I think it's really similar to the podcast we did on mindset, like way back in the day. We can link to that one too. I think grit and mindset really have a lot in common, but the reality is most people are going to be faced with challenges in law school that are sort of a different magnitude almost, at least academically, of the challenges they faced before. And how you react to that is really going to have a huge impact on your ultimate success and your happiness.
Yeah, because law school is full of speed bumps and reality checks.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is, anyone who got into law school by definition has done pretty well in their previous educational experiences, or otherwise they wouldn't be in law school. So I think for a lot of people, it can be sort of a rude awakening about, how much they're going to have to work, or how well they're ultimately going to do, or what they're going to have to do in order to do really well.
Yeah, I mean, the reality of law school is, I think when you start, it almost feels like you're studying a foreign language. I mean, it can really feel like every single thing you do is challenging in a way it hasn't done. Like reading becomes very challenging.
Yeah, absolutely.
Especially those early cases are in like old English and could be in Greek.
Yeah, exactly. Like, if I told you now, like, someone, the plaintiff moved for summary judgment, you understand what that means. But if I tell someone who's in their first week of law school, the plaintiff moved for summary judgment, they're going to look at me and be like, they did what?
Right, and then they're going to look it up in Black's Law Dictionary, and they're still not going to understand it.
Yeah, and it's going to be like 4 pages and referring to Rule 56, and they're going to be like, Rule 56 of what? Like, right. What are we even talking about here?
Exactly. Not to mention, you're going to be sitting in class, and your professors are going to start throwing around terminology that you're just not comfortable with, and that can be really, really confusing and frustrating for folks who are used to be high achievers. And
yeah, exactly. I mean, I think a lot of people, there are certain types, shall we say, who end up in law school. And, the academic overachiever type, there are a lot of those people. You might identify yourself as one of those people who's always been the straight A student, been the teacher's pet, gotten a lot of great feedback. That's why a lot of people want to continue their education, because this is something you're good at.
Right.
Or at least how you perceive yourself to be good at. And, as we talked about on the mindset, like that perception of I'm good at this or I'm not good at this can be really challenging to your ability to actually figure out how to be good at something.
Right. Or even I'm smart enough.
Right. Like I'm a smart person. That's why I went to law school.
Right.
Well, so is everyone else.
Right.
Yes, you are a smart person. That's great, but that's not sufficient.
Right. Everybody else in the room is smart too. I think the other thing, we talk about it a lot on this podcast, that everybody needs a little grit for is that curve. Those grades are nasty. And I think most of us who come to law school, we did pretty well academically. We were used to seeing pretty good grades. We were pretty proud of those. And maybe you've never been in a situation where you have a forced curve. You're going to see grades that may be even considered pretty good, that would not be considered pretty good in your past life. And you have to be able to deal with that. Or if you get grades that you're not happy with, you have to persevere and figure out how to be better at it. And that is, really, I think the challenge for most law students is how they're going to handle that bump in the road when it comes. Because I know very, very, very few law students who don't have some sort of reality check at some point in their career.
Even if you talk to most people who've ended up being law professors, almost all of those people will have some story of, oh gosh, no, I remember my first year contracts class, I got a C. Mm-hmm. And these are people who became a law professor. You said something interesting a minute ago. You said that, you have to do this to persevere. And I think it's actually more like you have a choice about how you're going to do this.
True.
You can, I think one of the key takeaways here is how you respond to these challenges is really within your control. And your grades ultimately are not within your control. This is something that you do your best, but then your professor gives you whatever grade they give you. And so I think getting fixated on the outcome can actually cause problems. I always laugh when we get calls from, not laugh, haha, but sometimes kind of laugh a little. When we get calls from incoming 1Ls who are like, I really want to make all A's in law school. And it's just like, you know what? I don't care how smart you are. I don't care how much you study. The odds of that happening are almost none. Mm-hmm. There's literally no one at any school who is making straight A's or straight A pluses. You can have an amazing GPA. You can be the top person in your class, and you're still not going to make straight A's. Mm-hmm. Maybe you have some A minuses, maybe you have a B plus. That's just the reality.
Yeah, I think that's true. And this is also something, looking down the road, if you are new to the law school experience, that's a very big deal in the bar exam, because that's another place where you can't be just fixated on the results. Of course, you want to pass the bar exam, but we can't control what happens once you submit your materials to the graders. You just kind of have to do your best and give it up to them, and the grades will fall where they may. It's so much about the process, and I think that's a really uncomfortable place for a lot of people.
Oh, absolutely. Of course, everyone wants to do well, but, I think you just have to accept the reality that you can't actually control the outcome. And once you give up trying to control that outcome, you can actually focus on the things that ultimately are most likely to result in a positive outcome. Mm-hmm. For example, I could spend 6 hours a day worrying about whether I'm going to get an A on my torts exam. And I can guarantee you there are people who do that, who fixate on well, what if I don't, my parents are going to love me, I'm going to get kicked out of school, I'll never get a job. These are easy pathways to go down, and I get it. Mm-hmm. Or you could spend that time taking a step back and saying, okay, where am I in this class? What do I need to do to position myself to do well, and spend those time, that 6 hours, actually taking practice exams and getting feedback and going to office hours. People have a choice about what to do and how to spend their time.
Yeah. And I think there's also a lot of stuff that will happen during the law school experience, because, as we oftentimes like to say, life doesn't stop for law school or the bar exam. Not. And, there are going to be external things that happen. We talk to a lot of students who run into their own health issues, in law school, or those of family members, significant others, pets, you name it. There's often, financial things that come up, or even good things. You meet the love of your life.
You want to plan your wedding.
You want to plan your wedding. There's all sorts of stuff that will happen. And I think those good or not as great things that will happen in life, they can also be points where you have to have grit to persevere, either to make sure everything gets done and that it's done well, but also if you need to overcome something that's difficult. And that doesn't mean that you plow through it and don't work through the hard things in life, but you do have to, have the willingness to continue to march on.
Yeah, I read an interesting interview recently with someone who was a Supreme Court clerk, I think for Scalia, And then they were talking about what he asked about in the interview. And one of the things he asked about in the interview for this woman he ultimately ended up hiring was, why were you not on the law review? And she says, well, I'll give you the honest answer. The honest answer is I was in the middle of writing my law review packet entry, and my cat got hit by a car and was like really injured, and I was too distraught to carry on. And he looked at her and he said, sometimes life happens, but that's okay.
Yeah. Well, and props to her for being honest, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure obviously Scalia's gone, but I bet he was an intimidating interviewer.
Yeah, no, I thought it was really interesting. I thought both sides of that were interesting. A, that she was sort of like, well, this is what happened, and like, you can judge me or not, but like, I just, shit happened.
Right.
Like, it's like we have a student, whose computer died and he hadn't backed up his submission right before he applied. Does that mean that he wasn't worthy of being on law review? No, I mean, shit happens.
Yep.
In that case, he should have backed up. But
yes, use Dropbox. Embrace the cloud.
Yeah, we don't actually think that he should tell someone that in an interview. He probably should make up a story about his cat dying. But point being, and I'm sure at the time, like, that was devastating for this woman. She's like super high. I mean, she's sufficiently high achieving that she got a Supreme Court clerkship.
Right.
Like, obviously, like a very high achieving law student. And I'm sure at the time it was devastating. You can see the pathway that you'd go down, like, oh, I'm not on law review. I'm never going to get a clerkship. Like, I'm never going to get a job. I mean, she was probably to school where you can get a job without law review. But, judges legitimately, like, want you to be on law review.
Or wonder why you're not.
Or going to ask, like, oh, I'm going to have to be explaining this for the rest of my life. And, like, what if I tell them my cat died and they think I won't be serious about, and I think the cat didn't even die. The cat just got hit by a car. But, what if I tell the person who's interviewing me that, like, instead of, like, persevering and, like, plowing through and submitting it, I was in the cat hospital, like, they're never going to think I'm serious, they're never going to hire me. You could go down this pathway, but none of those things are actually true, as it turns out.
Right.
So you have a choice about, and of course, in the time, you're going to be upset. Mm-hmm. But I think, learning to kind of take that step back and be like, okay, this is not a great situation, but probably people will understand. And if they don't understand, maybe I don't want to work for them anyway.
Right.
I'm sure I'll still get a job. Like, I'm not going to give up on trying to do well in my classes, because that whole, like, self-sabotage thing. Like, well, if I'm not on law review, I'm never going to get a clerkship, so I can just stop studying for the next 2 years. Not productive.
I think it's interesting, too, when you think about grit, that it isn't about, just to stay on the cat analogy, not to, like, freak people out who have cats. I mean, like, we love cats. But this idea that, like, it's not like you can't stop and be present and be upset about something. It's more what happens after that. Are you going to let that become your story that, or are you going to say, well, this thing happened, it wasn't, moving me forward, but now I've moved past it. Now I can pick up and continue to march on. I think that's more what grit is about. Because I think, in a way, sometimes when you read about it, and I was reading articles preparing for this podcast, it can feel a little like, just keep marching forward no matter what happens. And that's, I don't think, what they're going for.
Never be upset.
Yeah, never be upset. Don't be authentic. Don't, and we're the mindfulness camp, right? You need to be present. You need to be able to be with what's going on with you at the moment.
I mean, the easiest way, at least in, what I understand from the sort of like mindfulness community, is the easiest way to stop being upset about a bad thing that's happening to you is to be upset, but to drop that storyline.
Yeah.
So, and there's lots of great stuff. We can link to Pema Chandran's books on like Tonglen Buddhist practice, which even if you're not Buddhist are really helpful, just sort of practices where it's not that you just like pretend that you're not upset about your cat being hit by the car. Like, of course you're upset about that. It's an upsetting situation. That's a normal reaction. But you have to sit with that reaction and literally like feel that reaction, but then not start this whole storyline process about this is going to like destroy the rest of my life. Like, I should just drop out of law school. I'm never going to amount to anything if I can't like pull it together and pretend that I'm fine. Because that's really where, things can definitely go off the rails.
And lawyers are amazing worst case scenario people.
Exactly.
I mean, I definitely am guilty of that all the time. It's such an easy thing to do, and we're kind of trained to think that way.
Yeah, exactly. You're being paid basically to figure out someone's worst case scenario, if you're particularly as a corporate lawyer, like all the time, or even as a litigator. How many conversations did you have as a litigator about like, well, what's the worst thing that could happen here? And I would say we had those conversations a lot more often than like, what's the best case scenario?
Yeah.
And it's interesting because like if you're in a room with like the business people and the lawyers, the business people immediately go to what's the best case scenario. And from the lawyer perspective, they're just being really unrealistic. But I would say it's 50-50, like who's right. The lawyers are like, well, maybe that could happen, but more likely like this disastrous thing or this disastrous thing or that disastrous thing is going to happen. And I think, it's a valuable skill for your professional practice, but I think you have to be careful with that in real life.
And there are interesting writings out there by folks that we know, and we can link to a few of them in the notes that, some of that line of thinking also makes it difficult to like be in relationships. And, like,
I have a whole series on this.
But it can be really challenging when you start to look at the world in this way of the worst case scenario, that it can make you a challenging partner at times in your personal life. So that's always something to think about. Okay, but we've talked a lot about how you need grit, but I think it's always interesting to look at something like this and say, well, is this something I just have? Like, are just people like full of grit or not? Or is it something that can be cultivated?
Yeah, I think sometimes people, you might be listening to this thing, you're like, well, that sounds great, but like, I'm just not an optimistic person. And now you're making me feel even worse about myself. I should just give up.
Yeah. The answer is no, you shouldn't. So I think you can cultivate it. I think that's actually one of the things that a lot of this research around grit is trying to focus on. They are working with kids and trying to cultivate grit in children, because they are saying that is something that children of this generation apparently are seen as lacking. But I think, as an adult, and believe it or not, in law school, you're an adult.
Actually an adult, whether you
feel like it or not. You can still practice having grit. And I thought one of the things that they told children or parents to do with their kids, which I thought was really interesting, which I think you can still do as an adult, is just practice doing things that are hard or that you're not good at and get comfortable with that. I mean, we've talked about that as one of the things we recommend people to do before law school, is like take a class that can be really challenging, because you have to just get used to not being good at something.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, for me, I think I'm a little weird, but like that's basically the main reason I went to architecture school is that I could tell, like as an undergrad and before that, like I was just good at school and like I wasn't that challenged, and everyone gave me great feedback and was like, oh, you can graduate with highest honors, even though you did your honors thesis in 3 weeks and picked a topic at spring break. True story. But, at some point I was like, I could tell that because I wasn't really being challenged, that was ultimately like I was kind of afraid to push myself. And so it was a way to just kind of push myself into the deep end, query whether it was the best use of whatever, $100,000. But, I do say I took away from that. One of the things I really learned was this ability to like fail and be absolutely beaten down. It's a really harsh environment. Basically, the process is you spend weeks working on a project, blood, sweat, tears, you're cutting yourself, you're bleeding, like literal blood. You're not sleeping, you're putting your entire effort into this. It's very personal. And then you put it on the wall and a bunch of strangers tell you in front of your entire class why it sucks. And that was not fun. But it does kind of make you more comfortable with these like lower grade type of failures that you may have to experience later. So I look at it as a very valuable experience. I'm not saying everyone should drop this and like go to architecture school. But I think that mindset of like, it's useful, and you could apply this to law school. Like for a lot of people, this really is the most challenging thing they've ever done. And that's not a bad thing.
No, I think that's true. And sometimes just doing other things, you can even like do things that are challenging that would also be good for you. So, like playing on a sports team and doing something that is physically challenging.
Yeah, or something like taking up a new, skill-based sport, like skiing or yoga or tennis.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be like competitive with other people.
Yeah, it was interesting today. I was in a yoga class not too long ago, and the teacher was talking about, the importance of not judging yourself in class, and the fact that your body's going to be in a different place every day, and like just appreciating where your body is in the moment, and that the practice is doing the practice is what's important, not like how flexible you are or this or that. And it is just good to say like, oh, even in these different activities that we do, some of these themes still come out. Anytime that you're pushing yourself, you have to watch for judgment.
Right, and I think there's a reason that a lot of these things are called practice. Like, why do we practice law? Why do we practice yoga? It's not like you're ever going to be perfect at any of these things, and that's not the point. The point is not to reach, like, the perfection of, like, being the perfect yogi or being the perfect lawyer. It's always, always, always going to be a work in progress.
Oh, yeah, and the sooner in the perfect yogi.
Yeah, like, the sooner that everybody gets comfortable with this idea that, like, this whole thing is a work in progress. Like, that's the reason we have this language around it.
It's true. And I think one of the things I like about yoga is that it is such a fascinating study when you do it in a group of everybody just having such amazing different challenges, and you're all doing this thing together, but all of our bodies are so different, and I'm not very flexible, and so it doesn't matter how many years I've been doing yoga, and I've been doing yoga for years, there are just certain things that I just can't do.
Yeah, and like I happen to suck at arm balancing, you know, like I'm very flexible, but you ask me to do like anything beyond like the very most basic, like sometimes I can do the crow, I think, or whatever it is.
Oh, I'm terrible at the crow, yeah.
But like anything else, you know, I mean, of course it's like hard not to feel bad if you're in this class with like these people who are doing this like insane stuff, and you're like, how is that even physically possible? But then the reality is, like, sometimes you'll have a teacher who will literally like spend a lot of the class prepping you to do some arm balance thing, and then they'll really break it down like step by step. And occasionally, like very, very infrequently, but occasionally I've done what they said to do, and you're like, oh my God, it actually works. Like, this is actually not impossible.
Yeah. And sometimes there's a lot of value in falling over in front of other people and being able to like
and just laugh
be okay about it, you know.
Yeah, and it's
like,
kind of like a law school class. Like,
it is.
You might feel like everybody's laughing at you in the yoga class, but they're actually more concerned about their own stuff.
Yeah, like I can't tell you anything about any of the people who are in my yoga class today. Like
yeah, of course not.
I remember what the teacher was wearing, but that was about it. But that's because I was looking at her during the class, but nobody else. I mean, you're not, you know, it is important to just realize that it's really about your own performance and your own experience.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And I think keeping in mind that like you can cultivate this stuff and that, you know, you're not born gritty or not gritty. I mean, of course, some people are born like one way or another, but for most people, you know, these are really skills that you can actually cultivate.
For sure.
I mean, what are sort of some of the characteristics here?
Yeah, so I did some interesting research before this podcast, and it seems that there are 5 characteristics of grit. So we're going to quickly talk through them. And I guess if you don't have some of these characteristics, then the next step is to try and figure out, you know, how you can cultivate them or practice them, or at least be aware of that in yourself and look for those moments when, you know, we do fall on our patterns of not our best self.
Yeah, and I think it's, you know, this might sound like really dreary and you're like, oh God, like I have to spend more time like cultivating the perfect self. It's like, no, this could actually be fun, you know?
Right.
Like you can, I mean, I would think people ideally, you know, outside of school, if they want to sort of work on some of this stuff, ideally you'd pick something that you think is inherently fun and interesting and try to get better at it. You know, so for me, like that might, you know, I've been learning to ski, for example, and taking lessons, and like, yeah, of course you fall down. Or for a while I was doing pottery, and if you want to cultivate some Zen grit, that is a good way to do it. You know, get yourself the pottery wheel and some clay, and you're like, how hard could this be? Yeah, it's a lot harder than it looks.
Yeah, I think it is just a really interesting challenge to yourself to, you know, find those challenges. One article that I was reading was about kind of tips for parents. And it was talking about that some people in their household have a one hard thing rule, and that everyone in the household, including the parents, always has to be learning or trying to do one hard thing, one thing that's hard for them. So then the kids get to model the idea from the parents that everybody's always doing something that's hard for them. And I thought it was kind of an interesting idea that what if we all kind of went through life saying like we should all be kind of taking on one challenge. I mean, law school might be enough of a challenge for you.
Yeah, you might not need
you might not need like pottery or anything else on top of that. But what is kind of your one thing that you're working on, you know, and what's your one challenge? And I thought that was kind of an interesting idea of a way to just make, you know, this idea of having grit be part of your daily existence.
Yeah, I've also heard about either people or families or companies or groups or individuals having a designated like amount of failures that they need to have in a certain amount of time, you know, so maybe, and they'll actually keep a record like in a spreadsheet or a box or whatever, but like, what are the 3 things I failed at this week? And if you can't come up with that, then chances are good that you're not actually pushing yourself.
Yeah, that's true. All right, so let's go back to our 5 characteristics of grit. So the first one that they seem to talk about is courage, and this is really about not having a fear of failure. Fear of failure is something all of us high performers really typically have to worry about.
Yeah, and I think in this case, it's not that you don't have the fear. Again, like you might be afraid to jump out of that plane when you're skydiving, but if you want to try skydiving, you're going to have to do it anyway.
Yeah. That's very true.
It's not like you pretend like I'm not afraid of this. You can acknowledge like, yeah, this is scary, but I'm going to do it anyway.
And I think the other thing that comes with courage too, that I would kind of add to this in the legal space is something that we've also talked about, is really the courage to be your authentic self.
Yep.
And, we've done a podcast on authenticity, but this is something, that you also have to look at. Are you being courageous in not just like a perseverance type way, but being courageous in being who you are and putting yourself out there in the ways that you decide to do it. I mean, there are so many times, I think, as in running a business, as we frequently talk about, that like we'll have these moments of like, should we be doing XYZ, or like we putting ourselves out there, even starting this podcast, we were just like,
we're like, should we do this? No one wants to listen to us.
It might be like our family and like our good friends who like we guilt into listening to us. And, but what if we just hadn't been willing to say like, well, we can put it out there and if it fails, it fails. And we were really like humbled by the response of the listeners, but it was a really great reminder that sometimes you just have to like throw it out there and see what happens.
Yeah. And I think it's Brene Brown who's like, do you have the courage to show up?
Yep.
And show up in the way that makes you feel seen. I mean, the problem is if you are pretending to be something that you're not or someone that you're not, you never have that opportunity for someone to really like get you, because the person you're showing them is not like your authentic self.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of people in law school feel like they have to have this persona of like the perfect law student or the perfect young lawyer. And that's just not always realistic. And so, you might find like, oh, I'm not feeling a lot of support when something bad happens because I'm not telling anyone about it. Like,
right.
How can they help you if they don't know?
Right. And it kind of goes back to the injured cat story from earlier. But, I think that one of the things that's also cool about that story is she was being very authentic. She's like, this is who I am.
Yeah, these are my priorities.
These are my priorities. And
it's not like that's going to stop when you're like a lawyer.
No. And to be honest, I would like somebody working at the Supreme Court who is authentic about, having, important things in their lives and things that are more important than other, that.
No, and I think it's, I think ideally you need to sort of get clear on what your boundaries are before you start working. I mean, I could tell you a crazy story about, somebody in the law firm, like telling me not to go visit my dying grandmother. And I had a choice where it's like, do I get on that plane and basically say, you can like literally say you can fire me if you want to, but I'm going? Or do I keep working?
Yeah.
You will face those choices.
Yeah.
It's just the reality of the business.
It is the reality of that, yeah. Okay, the second characteristic is conscientiousness, and they describe it as having like 2 types, achievement-oriented or dependable. And what I thought was different about this, or interesting about this distinction is they were saying, like being dependable is really important, but what is grit is not just being dependable as far as like getting things done, but it's getting things done and being successful at them, which is really where the achievement-oriented part comes in. And I thought that was an interesting distinction. It kind of goes back to what you were saying about Brene Brown. It's not just about showing up and being dependable. It's like showing up and then doing a great job and being excellent.
No, that's a really interesting point. I mean, I think sometimes people think like, say that you're, on the board of a club or something, but you're like pretty low level and you think like, well, I showed up to the meeting. I can like check that box. I'm done. And like, okay, great. That's like better than someone who didn't show up. But that person who shows up like with ideas, who's done some research, who's willing to like take a leading role, that person's really like the most valuable player.
Yeah. I also think something in this current digital age that's maybe interesting to think about this in this context too is I think being achievement-oriented and being conscientious also comes with being present. And, these days being present is so much of like not multitasking and just, like going to the meeting and being in the meeting, or studying and just studying, or being with someone you are working with, talking to, love, and just talking to them or being with them. Because I think that...
Or like being in class and paying attention instead of being on your laptop, like buying stuff on the internet and playing solitaire.
Exactly. And I think it's...
Just showing up to class is only step one.
Right.
You have to actually be present, paying attention.
It's a very unique challenge. And again, presence is something that we can practice. I think it's just harder now for us than it used to be, just because of all the digital distractions. But I think it is something to just constantly kind of keep in mind, is that, show up, but be like your whole self and not be like half of a brain.
No, and I think this is a great example of where you could literally practice this. If you know that distraction is an issue for you and you're afraid it's impacting your class performance, just decide for 1 week you're going to leave your laptop at home and only take a piece of paper and just pay attention. Does that help you be more present? Probably leave your phone at home too. Leave all of your digital devices so that you're literally just there with a piece of paper and a pencil taking notes. Yep. How does that change things? I mean, this is a great example of a skill that you can develop that is not really rocket science.
Yeah. I know. I was just thinking the other day, actually about pre-cell phone travel.
Yeah, and when it was so nice.
I know, when we used
to disappear.
Yeah, we used to go to Europe, and I remember it was a big deal when the internet cafes were there because we could actually check email.
Yeah.
But we wouldn't check email every day. You'd check in just every few days, and sometimes it was really expensive to check email. But there was no, cell phones going off in the middle of the night while you're in Europe, and
somehow you still managed to find a place to sleep, find a place to eat.
Yep.
You didn't die, you weren't, you figured out what the train schedule was somehow or another. You figured out when the ferry was leaving, and sometimes you'd show up and they're like, sorry, there's not another one for a week, and you're like, oh, okay, I guess I'm stuck in Denmark for a week.
There are worse things.
There are worse things.
Yeah, I think it is just interesting to really think about the fact that, just doing, one thing or unplugging or being present is something that that I think actually makes you have more grit. I think you can, because you have more energy and you have more focus and you can actually process things.
Yeah, and you just have, your brain is not so distracted all the time. I think a lot of grit is really about this focus, being deliberate about where you're putting your focus and where you're putting your time. And if you're so scattered because you've got 14 devices going off at all times and people are pinging you from Slack and from WhatsApp and from Facebook, and you're actually interrupting yourself, that's not really a great way to live.
No, it's really not.
And it kind of leads into this next factor, which is the ability to have long-term goals and endurance.
Yeah, and where this really plays into, I think, the law school experience is this idea of practice, and more practice, and studying, and really, knowing that it takes work to get to excellence, and that you don't wake up one morning and have a super successful academic career. You don't wake up one morning and have a super successful law practice.
But I think sometimes people get confused about this because there's so much out there about just follow your passion. Follow your passion. If law is your passion, follow your passion. It's well, that's great that you're passionate about this, but you still don't know anything.
Right. You still get good at it.
You need actual valuable skills. If somebody came to me, if I'm a hiring partner in a law firm, and they're like, I'm so passionate about the law. I'm like, well, that's great. Could I see your transcript? Could I see your resume?
Right.
Could you tell me what you can do for me that's actually useful? Because I don't actually care about your passion. I care as a hiring partner about what you can provide for me as an employer.
Mm-hmm. And a few years back, Malcolm Gladwell came out with that book Outliers, which he talks about kind of this idea with his look at how many hours of practice truly phenomenal people put in.
And not just practice, but dedicated, deliberate practice.
And
it's if you're practicing the violin, but you're practicing scales incorrectly,
right?
Not really going to help.
No. And then a lot of these people practiced, 10,000 hours or some unbelievable number.
Yeah, and the best ones did an extra hour a day or something over the course of their entire life, basically. Yeah. And hour a day, 5 hours a week, 20 hours a month. That adds up pretty fast.
Well, and I think it's interesting when you think outside of the academic world about if you have any friends or know people who are truly kind of that type of dedication to a craft, like friends who are dancers or friends that are professional athletes or, musicians. And it is phenomenal when you talk to them about how many hours that they dedicate to this sort of work or did dedicate when they were younger, because I think most of us don't necessarily have that amount of dedication to something like our academic work until maybe we're really pushed to it by a specific challenge.
Yeah, a friend of mine who's a musician actually wrote a book called Practice, and it was about practicing. He was, I think, a Spanish guitar player or something, and it was interesting because he said, one of the things when he was doing this work where he was practicing hours and hours a day, he's like, my friends who work downtown as lawyers or business people or whatever in these offices, they would say to me I just can't believe that you put in this much time practicing. And he's like, I would watch them walk to work and I would watch them come home and they were doing more hours in the office than I was, but they just didn't see it that way. Yeah. He's like, you're practicing too. This is what you do.
Right. It's just different. So if you have some free time on a break, that Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers book is quite good. And it's a good thing to help you kind of think about the mindset of really building a craft, I guess.
Yeah, and thinking of law school as a 3-year process. It's not I have to do, perfectly on my first semester exams. It's this is a process.
Yeah.
And your legal career is a process. If you think law school is hard, try working as a lawyer.
Yeah, that's so true.
You're going to get out and be like, oh, great, I did really well in law school. And suddenly you show up to your first job and they're like, you don't know anything.
Yeah. Whoops.
Yeah. Or you get a new case and it's this isn't a topic you don't know anything about. You're going to constantly have to be doing this.
Yeah. The next characteristic is resilience, which they describe as optimism, confidence, and creativity. And resilience is something when we talk about all the time. You can't be, you can be knocked down, but you got to get back up.
Yeah, well, you have a choice.
Yep.
You could stay on the ground and be trampled, or you can figure out how to right yourself and right the boat and get whatever help you need to get moving again. We always have a choice about how to respond to these things. And sometimes people say, well, I'm just not naturally an optimist. And it's okay, well, you can learn to be more optimistic, or at a minimum, you can learn to be more objective.
It's interesting. I was talking to somebody else kind of about this idea about optimism specifically, and how many times within our day we have a choice to be optimistic, and especially in our world of information where the majority of our information is negative. That we really do have a choice on how we look at the world, and especially what we consume and then what we do with that information. And it always makes me think of this Mr. Rogers from Mr. Rogers' The Neighborhood quote, which I know is pretty crazy, but after, I think it was after 9/11, he was being interviewed, and he said that his mother would always tell him that anytime something horrible happened, it was very important that you look for the helpers, that it wasn't about the people who did the horrible things, it was always about the helpers.
Yeah, because there was always someone who stepped in, who was doing some heroic thing.
And the idea that there were always more helpers than the people who did the one, awful thing.
No, exactly. So you can kind of fixate on either of those that you choose.
Yeah, and they talk about that in talking to kids about awful things. But then, it's interesting because we look at our adults, and I'm like, if I read Facebook and see one more article about something horrible that's happening in the world, you just get into this mindset of wow.
But actually, the world is the safest it's ever been.
Right,
And I read the other day this amazing thing that was, with the peace agreement in Colombia, assuming that actually finally is finalized. Someone was like, there's literally no war in the Western Hemisphere. Or in North, I think it was in the entire Americas. Which they're it's been hundreds of years since that was true.
Right.
And suddenly with one agreement, you're like, oh, this entire set of continents, there's no war.
Yeah.
That's kind of amazing. No one's reporting on that.
Right.
that doesn't get page views.
No, exactly. And so, deciding how you want to look at the world and making that choice about optimism.
Well, and I think law too, lawyers are dealing with a lot of the bad stuff in life. People don't typically see a lawyer when things are going well.
Not often. No, not often.
So I think these characteristics of being able to be empathetic, for example, as a lawyer without taking, the burden of someone else. God, think of someone who's a family lawyer. You know, it's
Yeah.
just like, how do you even do that day to day? Like, you've got to be really conscientious about things.
Or death row work.
Yeah, exactly. Or like
Right.
criminal defense work
Yep.
or criminal prosecution, like anything, you know, criminal. It's like horrible things happen.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that?
Yeah. All right. Here's our last characteristic. Is resilience versus perfection.
You mean excellence?
I'm sorry, excellence versus perfection. And that the idea, you know, a lot of lawyers are perfectionists, and we should probably do our own podcast episode about perfectionists.
Yeah, Brene Brown has some really interesting stuff on that.
There's some really good stuff. But the idea that excellence is really an attitude, where perfection is more of an end game. You know, you want to be perfect. Something that's perfect doesn't necessarily mean it's excellent. It just means that it's perfect. Excellent is kind of something that you strive for. And I think one of the things that we often forget in the law school space is you're trying to hone a craft, and the idea that you're trying to be an excellent law student, to become an excellent lawyer, to serve your clients, or in whatever capacity that you are working is very important and something that you should have pride in. And I think that gets
something
lost
you should
in the
take
shuffle.
seriously.
Yeah.
You know, this is, I think people, you know, ideally should take themselves seriously as a professional, as a budding professional. You know, this is serious work.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that you can do great work by putting all this pressure on yourself to be perfect at all times.
Yeah. And sometimes great things aren't necessarily perfect.
Well, the other problem is law, at least litigation, is a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
You know, like if you basically stake your entire like self-worth on whether you win or lose a case, it's exactly the same thing as do you get an A+ on an exam or not. Like that's actually out of your control.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think this perfection idea is like, I'm going to win every single case. That's not, there's no litigator alive who is not lost. I mean, if they're a litigator, they're sometimes going to lose. That's the nature of being a litigator.
Yep.
So if you want to be perfect, you just can't do that.
Right. You can't take risks.
Yeah, you can't take cases.
You can't take cases.
I mean, you can't take a case.
You can't stick your neck out. Yeah.
But if your goal is, you know, to do the best job that you can possibly do for your client, both sides can do that, regardless of who wins. And that I think is ultimately the goal is, you know, you take this seriously, you do your best work, you show up, you're present, you know, you're working hard, you have goals and you have endurance, but ultimately you don't control the outcome.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, with that, I think we're out of time. There's a lot of stuff in there we got to keep talking about. So
yeah, we got several other ideas.
I know. Stay tuned for more podcast episodes on some of these themes. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on iTunes because we'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. Typically, we release episodes on Mondays. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Alison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.